Probably wondering what the hell this is, unless you're not, because you clicked on the video, so yeah. This is going to be kind of just a meme tier list, I guess. This tier list is going to be of how good, like, this selection of Yakuza characters would be as roommates. I did this mainly inspired by Tekking's video about One Piece characters as roommates, but since I'm, insanely addicted to Yakuza, I decided to do it for Yakuza this time around. Slash Like a Dragon, slash Ryuga Gotoku, slash whatever the f you want to call it. Kiryu's Wacky Adventures. Speaking of Kiryu, he will serve as our introduction to what makes a good roommate. Because if you've seen how Kiryu lives, like, if you've seen the interior of the Morning Glory Orphanage, it's pretty neat, and he definitely does a fantastic job at keeping it clean. But he's also just not, like, really good with money, and I feel like he'd kinda just... Well, first of all, I feel like he'd snore. But second of all, he's too old, you know? And I guess if you like older people, that'd be good for you, but, like, he'd be kind of strict, I feel. Well, no, he wouldn't make you do everything, but he'd definitely, like, ensure that every single task is split evenly, you know? So he'd be a good roommate. He'd definitely be tidy, he would be very nice. I think he'd be great if you just want someone to talk to, like you had a rough day at work, so you could just walk up to Kiryu and like vent to him, and he'll listen, because he's a great listener. So yeah. Next is Ichiban, who honestly, I'm tempted to put him in perfect, but I'm gonna put him in fantastic, because he's definitely messy. He's not like fantastic roommate in the way that he'd keep everything clean and keep out of your business when you need it, but he'd be just the best friend you could ask for, you know? He would help you out around the house, and he'd hype you up, and he'd play video games with you. Definitely. He'd definitely play video games with you. And yeah, he's really nice. He'd just listen to you whenever you need someone to talk to. Basically just do all the chores. He'd be amazing, you know? Alright, next is Majima. And I'm gonna be so for real, I have no idea where to put this man. I'm gonna put him in mediocre because, like, looking at Majima, he'd definitely leave messes. He's just too, like, depressed and kinda just, like, erratic, really. I think it'd depend on if he moves in with Seijima, because if he moves in with you and Seijima, he'd be a fantastic roommate. But without Seijima around, I don't really know if he'd be a good roommate, because he'd just be kind of like exist and be quiet, smoke a lot. That's another thing. I don't like smokers. I have asthma, and also it just smells gross. So yeah, he'd leave like ashtrays out. Seijima, I think Seijima would be a good roommate with Kiryu. He's kind of just Kiryu in a lot of ways. He's really similar to Kiryu in a lot of ways, but more gruff and more like, I'm gonna do things the old way, you know? But sometimes you just kind of need that, you know? Like a tough guy who can help you out. Definitely take out the trash without any issue. Probably cook a killer meal. Oh yeah, Kiryu can also cook. I think, actually, that's gonna bump him up to fantastic, because he's a really good cook, like, canonically. Yeah, Seijima would be a good roommate. My main issue with him would just be, like, I feel like he'd just leave, like, a shit ton of just raw beef in the fridge, you know? And that's a really odd complaint, I know, but still, he'd just, like, put beef everywhere. He'd leave steak out, or he wouldn't leave it out, but he'd stuff the fridge with meat, and be really just weird. Next is Akiyama. I think Akiyama is gonna go in an awful environment, because look, he's lazy. Sure, he's chill, but he'd just be smoking constantly. He's too lazy to get off his ass and do work. And that's fun. I love Akiyama, but he's pretty much being taken care of by Hana-chan, so I don't think he has the discipline to be a good roommate. He definitely help you get money though. Haruka, I feel like Haruka would be a very good roommate, fantastic roommate even, because she's really just like a normal person who had an idol career once, so she probably has a ton of money in the bank. She has a kid, so you'd have to deal with a kid, actually. That's gonna bump her down, but still. I think she'd go in a good roommate, just because she's just a good person. Tanamura. I feel like he's gonna be our first average because he'd do the work, but he'd do it really just lazily. He's not like Akiyama where he just wouldn't do the work. He'd definitely do the work, but he just wouldn't do it at a fast pace. He'd get bored, and he'd also just gamble a lot of his savings. And also as a cop, I just don't trust like that. Shinada. I want to put him in the perfect roommate because he keeps his house tidy, and he would thank you to the stars and treat you like a god or a goddess as long as you give him a home. Poor guy's been through enough already. Just let him have this. Yagami. I'm gonna put him in mediocre for many of the same reasons as Majima. He's like, if you look at the detective agency, it's pretty messy. He's really laid back and just does whatever he wants. But I feel like he would still take out the trash and make food and buy groceries and shit. He just wouldn't do it enough. He'd be like, hey Yagami, while you're out there, can you get me some food? Can you get me some cups of ramen or something? Be like, sure. And then he'd return and he'd have like a single cup of ramen and then 3 packs of cigarettes and 5 bentos. And that'd be all he eats. Just bento boxes and cigarettes. Kaito-san, you're back. I don't know about Kaito. I don't really know much about Kaito because I haven't played Kaito Files. But I feel like knowing him, he'd be a pretty average roommate. He wouldn't be anything special, he wouldn't be spectacular. He'd definitely leave behind some messes, but I feel like he'd definitely have more initiative and more pejorative than Yagami does. Ryoma. I don't know why I put Ryoma on this list. He's from ancient feudal-ass Japan. Awful environment, because he just wouldn't know how to live in modern day wherever you're living, you know? Okay, Date. I feel like Date would be a fantastic roommate, because he'd clean up after himself, he'd do all the work, he'd help out around the house wherever you need him, he'd be really nice, but he wouldn't have the shine that Shinada has. Still, he'd be a really good friend, he'd definitely be a good drinking buddy. It's fantastic, I think. Daigo Dojima. I want to put him in good roommate. Daigo has definitely cleaned himself up a lot since Yakuza 2 and 4, and he actually is a decent enough ruler now, but I don't know, I just wouldn't feel very safe being in an environment where I'm living with a Yakuza boss, even a former one, and he's the chairman of the biggest fucking clan in the Yakuza next to the Omi Alliance. But as a roommate, he'd definitely clean up after himself. He probably doesn't know how to cook anything but instant ramen because he probably gets all of his food handpicked from the farmers markets and stuff by like lieutenant advisors for the Tojo. But still, yeah, I feel like he'd be fine. Nothing special, nothing to write home about, but he'd definitely be a good roommate. Kaoru. I feel like, here's the thing with Kaoru. She would be a good roommate, but she would be incredibly rude to you. She would beat you up when you're not doing any work. She'd like just be like, why are you playing video games when you're just looking at your computer, and then she'd just whack you over the head. I feel like that's gonna go in an awful environment because she would take care of the house, but she'd push you out. You'd want to leave or get a restraining order or something. Kashiwagi. I'm gonna put him in very average. He'd definitely be very rude, and he'd do the work. But I don't know, I feel like he'd definitely help out, and he'd be like this really stern figure that'd be helpful. I'm actually gonna put him in good roommate. Especially after he became the bartender in 7 and Infinite Wealth. I feel like he'd definitely know how to clean up. He'd probably make you like a killer wine. But I don't know. As a roommate, I feel like he'd just get annoyed. Hana-chan. Perfect, honestly. No notes. Hana-chan literally takes care of Akiyama. She's a mother and he's a baby. She would just do everything. And let's say you'll have a splinter. She'd just say, oh, sit down. And then she'd just do everything for you. Sure, she'd be a bit of a prickle doing it, but she'd still ultimately care about you at the end of the day. She'd be sure to let you know whenever you do something that crosses her personal boundaries. She'd be just super nice and calm and collected a lot of the time until you make a mess, and then that's the thing with Hana. She's the strongest character in the series. She'd probably kick the shit out of you if you've made a mess, but other than that, she'd definitely clean it up. And she tolerates Akiyama. So I feel like she'd definitely tolerate even the shittiest roommate you can think of. Makoto. The blindness is definitely a contributing factor that puts her down a bit, but at the same time, she's an incredibly kind and caring person. She'd basically give you free massages whenever you want. I'm gonna put her in good roommate because from everything that we know about Makoto, she's a very calm, kind, and peaceful person. And the only time she actually basically snaps is when her brother is literally fucking dead and she wants the Dojima brothers' heads on a pike. So I feel like the only issue with her would be she's blind, or at least has impaired vision, so she would have struggles moving around and stuff, she'd bump into things, but she definitely makes do with what she has, and also, I don't want to put blindness as a factor that makes someone objectively worse. It's just something that some people have, and the fact she got it from trauma makes it even sadder. So, good roommate. Watase. I feel like Watase would take care of everything, but he'd work you to the bone. He'd be kind of like Kaoru in that way, but slightly less strict, but he definitely, well actually, I think I'm gonna put him in average. He'd do his fair share of the work, he'd definitely like help out, but he wouldn't really have anything else going for him outside of his status and that swag. So I'm gonna put him in very average. He wouldn't, I don't, actually, looking at how he treats his Omi guys in Gaiden, I don't think he'd, like, work you to the bone. I think he'd just be a dick sometimes, or be like, damn it, why are you playing that game? And then he'd take your controller and forcibly change it to Call of Duty so you can get some sick headshots or some shit. He wants a war, after all. Reina, I'm gonna put her in Fantastic. You could probably tell I have some bias. I think Reina would just be, like, she'd be as close to perfect as you can get without being perfect. She would help out, of course. She would help you through a lot of your personal stuff. She'd get you drinks whenever you need them. She'd really just serve as a really just nice person in your life. She'd be great to talk to. She'd be great to just have nice conversations with. You could have a cup of tea with her in the morning. And then once you're off to work, she would help take care of the house, and once you're back, you'll take care of the house for her. It'd just be like this really nice mutual relationship of just really good friends. Rikia. Here's the thing with Rikia, I think he would have a room that's covered in posters of rock bands, and he'd be blasting music. So, very average, honestly. He wouldn't be anything special, but he definitely has the enthusiasm, and he has a lot of drive, and a lot of just joy in his heart. He has a lot of whimsy. I love Rikia, my beloved. So I think this is going to be the first future crime scene, because if you mess up once around her, or even just like a fucking bug just skitters in through the door while you're heading in, she's going to get the Komijuru on your ass, and you're never going to be found again. You're just going to be buried, dead and buried, and she's just going to be like, they're like, I don't know what happened to them, officer. Kazuma, we don't really get to see much of Kazuma, but given what we do see, I feel like he'd be a good enough roommate. Kind of average in a lot of respects. He wouldn't be insane. He wouldn't help a lot, but because he'd just be gone a lot on his missions. When he does come back, he'd just have a really nice father figure to chat with. And that'd be fun, honestly. It'd be nice to just have someone to talk with in your house, even if they don't do much and aren't around a lot. Tachibana. I feel like Tachibana is going to go in perfect roommate. He literally owns a real estate firm. But he keeps every single one of his rooms and every one of his buildings really firm and proper. He ensures that everything is to standard and to snuff. So he'd just keep everything in your house nice and pretty. He would just be like this great guy, really. And also, a huge part of Tachibana's arc in Yakuza 0 is that he wants friendship. He wants to find a friend that doesn't just see him as a business partner or someone to use or exploit. So, having that person in your life and being able to help that person, I feel like that would be genuinely just so enlightening and so helpful. You could help each other through both of your issues. Alright. Takasugi. I'm split between awful and fantastic. I think it really just depends on if you have a loan out, so I'm gonna put him in just average it out. But if you don't have a loan out, he'd be a fantastic roommate. He'd just be really fun to hang out with. If you have a loan out though, he'd torment you. He would not let you up. He'd just be like, go make me some money right now, or else it'll tick up. And just stuff like that over and over and over. The Florist of Sasai. It's hard to pick, but I feel like he'd just be that roommate who just stays up in their room all day on the computer. Except in this case, instead of playing games or watching porn, he'd just be like looking at the city. You'd never really talk to him. He'd knock on the door and he'd be like, I'm busy. And then you'd just never get to talk to him or even see him. He'd never show up. And then a few weeks later, you'd find out he exists because he's taking out the trash from his room. Where do you even get all that food? And he's like, oh, I get it whenever you're asleep for my homeless market. Yayoi Dojima. We don't really see much of Yayoi either, but I feel like she'd be a good enough roommate at least. She would definitely not be an insanely good roommate, but actually, hold on. She's shown to be pretty bossy and pretty strict. I feel like she would just be like, she does her job, she treats you well when you're doing your job, but when you're not, she's just constantly upset and up in your face about it. Andre Richardson. I feel like he'd just use the housing complex as something, as a funnel for Black Monday, but honestly, as a person, I feel like he'd just average. You wouldn't really see him around much. He'd just hop in sometimes and say, if you're looking for the groceries, they're outside the door. And then he'd just leave. He'd sometimes show up and do his work, but he'd mostly just be preoccupied with Black Monday. Hiroki Arai. I don't really know where to put Arai. He's super prim and proper. I feel like average or good would be fine. I'm gonna put him in average because he is corruptible. He can be a bit of an asshole, but I don't know. I don't feel like he'd be insane. He would be helpful. He would help out around the house. Mostly just be dedicated to the grind set. Iwano is made for the mediocre roommate tier. He literally says it himself. He's just too addicted to the high life. So he'd just be laying back, reclining and watching TV, and he'd be like, give me a beer, and then clean up the house. And he'd be like, hey, Wano, fine. And then you bring the beer back, and he's just like, it took too long. What took you so long? So, but he wouldn't be actively cruel or malicious, I don't think. He'd just be kind of a selfish dick. Bryce would be a future crime scene. I'm sorry. This man runs a cult. He'd try to get you inducted into the cult. And if you refuse, he's gonna kill you. He was an assassin. You're dead if you don't join Palikana. So I don't trust that. I don't trust like that. Masataka Ebina. We don't really get to see much of Ebina's actual personality outside of his relationship with Arakawa. But he's definitely very cruel and vindictive, so I'm gonna put him in awful. I feel like if you wrong him once, he would not get on your case about it, but he'd subtly be like, oh, I feel a bit sick today, can you take out the trash? And then you'd take out the trash and you notice it's very heavy. And you'd look inside and you'd see it's just like, there's just a fucking dead animal in there. You'd be like, what the fuck was that, Abby? And you'd be like, and he'd slowly fill up the house with garbage and shit. You'd have to clear it up every single day and you'd just be amused watching you work. So, awful environment. Same with Alex Lee guy, I forgot his name. What is it? Your wheelchair man? Eiji Minamura, that's what his name is. Eiji seems like a cool guy on the surface, and you'd have like a good few weeks with him at first, but then he'd slowly start manipulating and gaslighting you into doing things he doesn't want to do. He'd like get up from his wheelchair and you'd see that and you'd be like, what the fuck? You could do that the whole time? I was doing all this work for you. And he'd just turn around and be like, shut up. And he'd like pull out a gun and be like, you're never going to speak of this again. And look at the way that he treats Chitose. Speaking of, I should have added the Yakuza 8 and 7 companions to this list. Whatever, it's long enough already. So I feel like he'd just be awful. Little baby Iwami. Future crime scene, that's because I would kill him, personally, with my bare hands. He has such a god complex, such a massive ego. He just needs to be the best in everything he does, and I hate people like that. I hate people like that so much. He just put you down constantly, make you do all the work because he feels he's too good for it. And I wouldn't appreciate that at all. Fuck you, Iwami. Sawashiro. I feel like Sawashiro is kind of in the same boat as Andre, but instead he'd show up sometimes covered in blood and he'd be like, oh, it's an assassination mission. You'd be like, oh, you just never talk to him because you're scared of him. But I feel like he would like cook, he would definitely like, he would cook, he would do the dishes, he would like clean up trash, he would do his chores, but he would just not be around much. Jungi Han. This is 6, Jungi Han, by the way. I feel like with Joongi Han, he'd like, if you mess up once, he'd just see you as dirt, or below dirt. And he'd shove your face into a fryer when he's cooking. And that's just a super toxic environment. The sort of environment where you just can't ever show any weakness because he'd see you as weak for that. Shibusawa. Shibusawa is a lot like a Rai in that he's dedicated to the grind set, but he's also dedicated to forming a title for himself. So I feel like he'd just leave really early on because you're not interesting enough for him. Or he'd leave early on because he earned up enough money to attain a nicer house. And while he's your actual roommate, while he's there, he's just never around. He's always just doing work. Kido. Kido is going to be the first good in a while, but I think he's going to be fantastic. Because Kido is just like, he's just a really cool guy, frankly. He'd kind of just hang out, and he'd help you whenever you need help. He'd be super nice and polite and shit. I don't know, I feel like he'd be, nothing's amazing, he wouldn't be perfect, but he'd definitely be like a roommate you'd want. Kuze. Kuze would be like, he'd be constantly smoking for one, which is a big downside, but other than that, he's definitely an asshole, he's definitely rude, but I feel like he'd do all the work, and he would listen if you need help. And he would show you respect if you do the work, as much as he does the work. And earning Kuze's respect is a huge boon, really. Because that'd just be like, you earn the respect of not only a Yakuza lieutenant, but a very powerful and driven one at that. He'd do all the work, he'd never leave behind messes outside of maybe ashtrays. He'd also just be really fucking cool. So, I feel like he'd be a good roommate. Especially if you take into account his portrayal on RGG Online, where he's just way more chill and less hard-assed because he isn't in the Yakuza anymore. At least I think he isn't in the Yakuza anymore. I can't read Japanese. I feel like he'd just be a good roommate. Nothing amazing, nothing spectacular, but he's someone you'd want to have as a roommate if you're fine with being pushed around a bit. Aizawa. So here's the thing with Aizawa. He wants to make a difference. He doesn't want to just sit around and let everyone else do the work for him. So here's what I'm picturing. He'd just sit you down and be like, I'm gonna do all the chores, so you can just hang out. Be like, oh, thanks, Aizawa. And then he'd do all the damn chores, and he'd do them all fantastically. And honestly, no, I gotta put that in fantastic. He would just constantly be working, but it would be working to help you have a better life. Because he wants to prove himself. He wants to prove that he is strong and he can match up to the Dragon of Dojima. So, Seshiro Munakata. Just awful. He'd just look down on you, he'd be a shitty boss, he'd be a shitty person in general, because it's Munakata. What do you expect? So, I don't know, sometimes the police show up at our apartment and you're like, what the hell, what's going on here, Munakata? And he's just like, oh, those are my bodyguards. They're here to make sure that you work. Maybe, can I have a break then? No! Nishikiyama. Honestly, I know this is Yakuza 1 Nishikiyama, but this is the ending of Yakuza 1 where he's a nice person. It's the way that I'm seeing it, and when he's redeemed himself. I think he'd be a fantastic roommate. He's a lot like Kiryu, but more ambitious and a lot more energetic. And I feel like he'd just be fun to talk to. You could just talk about your interests with him, and he'd be like, oh, cool. Sometimes he'd be a bit of a dick, but that'd mostly just be whenever he thinks you're annoying. He'd probably let you know when he thinks you're being annoying before he slaps you. He's definitely super emotional, though, so you'd probably want to stay away from him whenever he's going through an episode. So, but still, Ryo Aoki. Here's the thing. Aoki is like... or Masato, really. I feel like he'd be average. It'd just be like, the main issue with it would be, you just get like a bunch of people every single morning that are just like, at the door asking for autographs and news crews and shit because you're living with a politician. And it'd be kind of chaotic, but I feel like once you get used to it, he himself would just be a fine enough roommate. He wouldn't be amazing, he wouldn't be fantastic, but he'd be serviceable. Ryuji. I'm of two minds with Ryuji. I feel like, on one hand, he might kill you if you insult him, but on the other hand, he'd probably be the sickest fucking dude to just go to a bar with and play poker, or play darts. And You could play games with him. You could play a video game with him, like a shooter game. Or like, no, he'd love fighting games. He'd love Street Fighter and shit. He'd be the type of guy who makes his entire room to like a man cave, and he'd go into there and he'd see a big golden dragon on the wall, like a dragon poster, and it'd be super cool, and there'd be like a katana hanging up, and then he'd show up behind you and be like, pretty cool, eh? And he'd be like, oh yeah, for sure. So, and besides, he definitely works. He works his ass off, and I feel like he'd be a good roommate. My main thing with him is just he's very aggressive. He could kick your ass through a window if you wanted to, if you were annoying to him. Here's Baba, and I'm gonna base this entirely off of one thing. I think he's gonna go in fantastic roommate, if not just good. I'm gonna put him in fantastic because Seijima had to room with this guy for several years in the prison, and he never complained. In fact, he and Seijima and Baba became really good friends afterwards. Seijima was legitimately hurt by Baba's betrayal. And Baba and Shinada's fight is basically just Baba. It's basically just him learning to grow a backbone. So I feel like Baba would be just a decent, if not really good roommate. I'm gonna put him in good right now because I don't think he'd be fantastic, but he'd definitely be like a roommate you wouldn't be upset to have. Futoshi Shimano. I'm sure I don't need to elaborate further on Futoshi Shimano going in future crime scene. He'd use you and then throw you out like the trash. Kosei Shishido, my beloved, my husband. My bias is definitely going to be showing if I put him in fantastic. I'm going to put him in good. He wouldn't be like an amazing roommate. He wouldn't help out a lot. He wouldn't like... No, he would help out a lot. He just wouldn't be like a super good attitude. But he'd definitely be smart. He's shown smarts. He's shown a lot of strength as well. He'd just be kind of like one of those roommates where you get to know him a bit more and you realize, oh my god, I'm so sorry about everything. Oh my god. And then he'd just be like, nah, don't sweat it. And I just feel like he'd be just like a kind dude to hang out with because he is friendly with Kiryu. The only reason he even fights against Watase dissolving the Omi alliance is just because he's so desperate to hang on to his only shred of family. So actually, I'm gonna put him in fantastic because he's incredibly loyal. He needs a family, and if you can provide that family for him, he'll give you a family right back. He'll help you out a lot. So hey Dojima, future crime scene. If you're a woman, he'll definitely try to take advantage of you, and if you're a man, he'd just use you like a goddamn tractor or something. Future crime scene. Somea. Here's the thing. Somea is like, very average, I think. But not because he's like mediocre or average. He's two extremes. He'd be a really good roommate because he'd be super kind, he'd help out a lot, he'd help you a lot. But at the same time, given the way that he hits Kiyomi and shit, that he hit Kiyomi and everything, I feel like he could become physically abusive. So actually, I'm gonna put him in mediocre. Because he would be nice, but it'd be toxic, really toxic. Toru Hirose. Hirose, dude, it's beat Takeshi. Hirose is an assassin, sure, but he'd never take his work with him. He'd really just spend a lot of his time at home being a really cool dad figure to you, and you'd wonder where he goes at night. And that's all it boils down to. Tsubasa Kurosawa. I feel like it'd be kinda awful. No? Kurosawa would definitely he's a cancer patient, first of all. Against cancer patient. Nothing against cancer patients, but that would get in the way of him doing things a lot of the time. So he wouldn't be able to like, provide much for you. You'd probably have to take care of him a lot. But all the while, he's going to be a big asshole towards you. Especially if you don't show the same level of cynicism that he does. So Mine is incredibly loyal. He is beyond loyal. But I feel like if you don't get to know Mine super well, then he won't know you at all either. And he'd really just spend a lot of his time doing work and making money. He'd make a killer income for the house at least. But he wouldn't be a really interesting person at first, but once you get to know him, he'd start climbing the ranks. But I feel like a good roommate is fine for now, because he would definitely do all his work. He'd do the taxes and shit, he'd pay for everything. Honestly, I'm convincing myself he deserves fantastic. As long as you don't bother him when he's busy, as long as you're nice to him, he'll probably be nice to you back. Tendo. Future crime scene. He's a murderer. He loves killing things. He'd just kill you. Once you get under his skin enough, he'd just kill you. Or like, even just for fun, he'd kill you. Itaka Yamai. Here's the thing with Yamai. I think he'd be a good roommate for certain people. If you're introverted and just quiet and do your own thing, he'd definitely respect you that, and he'd respect you. But if you're loud and super friendly with him, he'd just hate you, which sucks. I can't get close to my wife because Yamai is my wife, but still, I feel like he'd be a good roommate as long as you do your own thing and he does his own thing. He'd also probably cuddle with you a lot because he's always cold, so he'd want extra body warmth. And honestly, that's really sweet. A good roommate, I think. Hey, we're getting to the end here. Lao Gui. The dude's an assassin, but outside of that, we don't really see his personality. I'm gonna put him mediocre. He wouldn't kill you because he isn't getting paid for it, but he doesn't have much of a personality outside of that. He'd just show up and he'd be like, okay, I'll do this, you do this. He'd give you like a list of tasks to do. He's super structured and shit. He wouldn't give you any sick days either. So yeah, Hamura would be a very toxic person to just hang out with, honestly. He's cool, I like Hamura a lot, but he's just, like, look at the way that he treats some of his boys in Judgment. He's kind of just weak, and he hides behind a lot of his boys. He's super just shitty to Yagami, of course, because of everything going on between the two, but whatever. But I don't know, I feel like it'd just be an awful environment to live in with Hamura. Mitsuru Kuroiwa. Future crime scene, probably for obvious reasons. He is a murderer. However, I don't feel like Kuroiwa would be a terrible roommate. It's just like, once he gets an opportunity, he is going to kill you so he can test Aradeku 9 or 89. So I feel like he'd just die eventually. He smokes, which is a big turnoff for me. I think I'm gonna put him in an average roommate. He's nothing extraordinary, and he'd probably kill you if you bully someone, if you were a bully, but past that, he'd definitely be just a cool guy to hang out with. He'd be fun to chat with, and also he could do a lot of stuff, actually. Good roommate, I think. He could do a shit ton of stuff, really. He could fix air ducts and things. He is a fixer. He is a handyman. He's like, I don't know, I feel like Kuwata would be a really just fun dude to hang out with. He'd just be like a chill guy. You can just be yourself around as long as you aren't a bully. Soma, future crime scene, again. Dude, he'd kill you. He'd just kill you in the middle of the night if you snore too loud. He'd just stab you. Akutsu would not do any of the work. He'd just leave a mess everywhere he goes, because he's used to Soma doing a lot of his work for him. But I don't feel like he'd be like an awful environment to be in, because he does treat his boys well. And he's very swaggy, super laid back. I don't know, I feel like maybe mediocre, yeah. And then I'm gonna make an extra tier just for this guy. I haven't fully completed Kaito files yet, but I know the shit that this guy does. Kyoya. Kyoya is a fucking sadist. As far as I can tell, he's the most evil character in Yakuza, and that's saying a lot. So, and that will wrap up this tier list. Not much else to say outside of the fact that Majima is my husband, Yamai is my wife, and we are in a very happy polyamorous relationship. Thank you for watching. My name is Wooly, and I am out.